I'm David Capelli, and this is Carla Mays, and we'll be presenting on the Pandemic Reset, Equitable Planning, Governance, Finance, and Technology Implementation. We're going to be having an open dialogue for Q&A at the end, so please put all questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. So our mission at Smart Court is driving governance, finance, and technology implementation research for next generation leaders in times of crisis for digital and physical infrastructure and the development of smart cities and regions. So as a team, we're co-founder of Smart Court. Carla's head of our global research. She's currently at Urban Land Institute Pathways to Inclusion Fellow in San Francisco, and last year was a Clean Energy Leadership Institute Fellow in San Francisco. It has multiple degrees from San Francisco State in Public Administration, Haas School of Business, and Emergency Management from Long Beach. I head all of our global partnerships. I've served as chairman of the Miami-Dade County Millennial Policy Board, where we've actually instituted the first zero fare transit policy countywide, and been working on COVID-19 transit equity with the mayor's office and with fellow World Economic Forum, and started this work, Carla's pre-Uber in Miami at University of Miami. So that's us, the London School of Economics Global Cities Program in 2018. What grounds us to discuss COVID-19 in this pandemic is we've been leading emergency management and knowledge gaining from 5+ years working front lines of fires, hurricanes, and COVID-19. So here in San Juan, Puerto Rico, post Hurricane Irma. In the middle is us working the state of Hawaii Emergency Management Agency during COVID-19, as well as the right with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. As you see with our fellowships with Singularity University, Global Innovation Summit, and with the Global Shapers, as well as delegates to the Global Climate Action Summit, our experience has grounded us to discuss COVID-19 today. So our recent research collaborations and presentations, we've been presenting at American Planning Association. We're calling into their federal policy days on smart systems integration, equitable community development policy, and hazard planning. So things like COVID-19 and disasters, crisis emergency management in Puerto Rico, on smart capacity building, and then at the American Society of Civil Engineers International Transportation Conference on smart mobility for smart cities and perspectives on equity and inclusion engineering. We also curated and led Florida's first transportation camp, as well as presented at Transportation Camp Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, as well as UCLA Luskin on digital equity in 2015, some of the first sessions on that, and participated in Seattle's transportation camp. As you see here, these are some of our high-level programs with the White House and different congressional committees. So we'll begin
the Obama White House.
The Obama White House, I would say, pre-2016, and then to sort of list some of our sponsors from both the private sector, government, and philanthropic sector, our limited list.
So basically, let's just jump right into to this now. And we wanted to tell you this because we're going to say a lot of things that are going to really, that don't fit the narrative of what folks think of when they think of public transit or they think of mobility. As we all know, Western cities have a dystopian effect that we do not see in Asia. We see this in Europe, and we see this in the United States, and we see it in Canada. This dystopian effect is the homelessness and the housing challenges with gentrification, displacement, future of work challenges, digital divide, and we're seeing this a lot in digital systems, particularly in California, where all digital platforms have been engaged, and there is no face-to-face interaction. When we already knew, I used to work for the California Emerging Technologies Fund, where we already had assessed prior to the pandemic, 30% of Californians were offline. But we still keep pushing forward with digital systems without addressing the digital divide. And this becomes a real problem during COVID, as we've begun to recognize with mobile systems for transit, for unemployment, and other vital resources to get to be able to get those safety nets going. There's a lot of colonization upon colonization. So when we look at our new structures, we actually have to look back at urban planning. In Robert Moses' way of thinking, we just reversed Robert Moses in the fact that instead of car, we're really anti-car. And we're so anti-car that we haven't fixed our other problems that actually led to the reason why Robert Moses and Justin Herman, particularly in my San Francisco, these are the really challenges that we are looking at as we begin to plan for everyone. The bifurcation in cities where we have building for the rich, so we have luxury towers, and then we have kind of like poverty trap rentals, that are characterized by the AMI categories. And if you should fluctuate or do better, that you might end up losing your housing, and then there is no middle. So there's nowhere for you to go except to move out of the city. Access to capital when it comes to BIPOC communities and BIPOC community-led projects and things is very hard. Even our relationship between David and I am California born and raised, born in Los Angeles, educated in Bay Area, and all these initiatives got started in the Bay Area, but it took David in Florida for us to really, be able to take our research and be able to work on these things. So access to capital is a real barrier that's causing this dystopian effect, because the real folks aren't being able to do this. Upward mobility challenge, like I was describing, with the idea of you have rich and poor, you don't really have anything in between, and the solutions for those things tend to be very rich and poor. We're very sustainable to threats. And we mean threats that are man-made as well as natural occurring things, from sea level rise to fires to hurricanes and the like. Are this dystopian effect, because of the bifurcation, is actually driving these kind of scenarios where we're actually seeing, like right away in San Francisco, we saw the decline. We didn't even really get through 3 months of the pandemic before we had a huge shift. And so that's why, in the other slide, in the upcoming slides, we'll get to exactly why that is. And then the growing population is not the one that we tend to make policy for. We make policy for the top of the pyramid. So one thing that is, David and I have been really traveling back and forth to Asia to really understand what is going on, and then we've been to Canada and of course been to Europe, looking at like what are the things that we're seeing that is different, and what is driving the differences in an Asian best practice. So citizen science, understanding who the people are and their mobility patterns versus a narrative. Being able to look at long-term planning and financing versus pilot projects that are short-term and that tend to be either place-based projects that are too small in scope to really look at, or basing everything on a European model. And we'll discuss this more. And we really have to work on curbing the dystopia. It's not adding more technology. It's actually, it has to be solving a problem. They really focus on public administration. In the smart city, we focus on technology in a Western sense. They do real-time crisis management. We were spending time with Japan and talking this over with Sendai City, which in 2011 had the big earthquake followed by the tsunami, and then how they were able to build back better, and what that really means, not just like the Biden slogan, but then what does that really mean in being able to do so. And that's, kind of that in, looking at real time understanding from the ground level, really ground truthing this, and then having right folks on project that understand these things, that aren't figuring it out. We've got to move from that, and managing the smart city in crisis, and looking at equity in systems. So as run through these things real quick, we have a rapidly dystopian effect in American cities. Homelessness, business closures, municipalities that are having trouble. And then those that aren't having trouble are really seeing the dystopian effect, but because of high-level systems where they're looking at tech or the stock market, they're not really, the two are really divorced of each other. But in the American and Western context, if the stock market is doing good, then things must be robust. And that is something that we have to really start to look at. Equity in municipalities, in equity and digital divides. Everything in our safety net portfolio now, due to COVID, is online, which is causing a great distress and, and driving this depression that we're having. Looking at smart cities and corporations spend a lot of time trying to educate people on what's going on versus then implementing a solution. And then we see more of these things in marketing. A lot of marketing to people, a lot of educating people. This model must change. We've got to spend most of our time implementing solutions that are built from the ground up. We've got to move away from small scale European models of looking at what a Sweden or Denmark or other countries are doing, as they are all failing in COVID. And they do not have a multi-ethnic, multiracial way of really addressing these things. They're monolithic and very cute, but the thing is, in practice, they've created the dystopian effect that we are seeing. So these issues that we have to start looking at is like, looking at why does a Singapore work versus like what is going on. And one of the things that we looked at was multi-ethnic, and from the beginning, looking at planning that we were going to have to address equity in those issues. So this is what we've got to really be looking at, is addressing equity by design first and not an afterthought. A lot of times we put in, because we start off at pilot programs that are funded for specifics, they weren't coming from the community, and they definitely weren't representative of the folks that were there. We tend to get a narrative, and we've got a great narrative that is really representing what we're calling green crow, which is creeping people from being able to access services and goods and services, and then funding things that are actually causing a negative externality in the COVID times that we're in right now. These things are actually hurting people as being able to access goods and services and things, because transit is not perfect. And what I mean by that is that transit has to be somewhat going toward, running in the neighborhoods by bus or train. There has to be an accessibility factor to how we live our lives, our lives, and how we have to create that equity. So initiatives of car free, we took this up at UCLA this year at the Transportation Symposium, that car free had indeed caused more death and suffering. And that it was a punitive action versus being something that was allowing for more people to catch transit. Parking measures hurt a lot of disabled people from being able, and seniors, to be able to get to somewhere and get out of the car and access, medical care, being able to access groceries and other types of things. And slow streets actually began to trap communities, such in Oakland and in San Francisco, trap these communities, moving transit stops out further from them being able to be accessed. And then biking was not instituted where they were ADA and banking and mobile and digital access were, these things all were built for top of the market. And so and rideshare and the like. So what we have to do is be very cognizant on going back through these things and looking at digital equity, and then where the money is spent and how is money going to be spent, so that these policies really reflect from the ground up, that it reflects a digital, a digital footprint that is equitable, and that the actual investment of public space and public dollars are actually being used for all versus the top of the market. That's why we saw transit agencies quickly erode ridership. And then what we didn't go back and look at, and what we're going to be doing is looking at how do we really be able to have good visuals on these measures, and how did they fare during COVID-19, and so we can have the adequate recovery.
So a lot of our work has been around this Western dystopia and an East-West comparative of applied research, learning from Asia, in Asia, best practices. So earlier, before, right when the pandemic started, we were spending a month in Singapore riding their public transportation. They have a public transportation for all approach. As you see here, it's ADA accessible, and Carla will get into each aspect of place. They do multicultural and aging in place. So the entire governance is holistic. It's not just the Department of Transportation. Their entire federal and local government is tied around designing for the multicultural city from the beginning and universal design from birth to earth. Modern inclusive high density urban planning. In the United States, this would be gentrification, displacement, crime, and everything Carla talked about. As we see here in Singapore, you have the real 15-minute city. You have high density, affordable housing for purchase. So people own their units, and the government builds this housing on public land by the transportation stops, and they have hawkers and cafes around, so you have the food security. So they do high density, but we don't see the Western dystopia around that.
So, and you see a lot of how, pedestrian safety is really key. And they've really done a lot to make sure that every housing complex, every place is first, that they've gotten that transit layer completely done. So you understand people with children, those with disabilities, universal design is really incorporated into everything. And then now they've started imposing stricter and more punitive actions against cars, because you can do that. Now that we've dealt with the pricing, we've dealt with the accessibility issues and the mobile and other types of ways of getting around, then we can move on to doing these things. It's not doing it first. So we look at intelligent systems, and this might be like, oh my God, being a Black person in Singapore, looking at this, at first I was kind of taken aback, and then after I understood it better, then you don't have to have police around, right? Police come when they're needed, versus that it's being used to like profile people and other types of things. But they've thought through these processes and worked, really hard before they instituted them. And they weren't pilot projects on the people first. They started with that in understanding that. And what we've been doing is pulling back the layers of the lies that are being told and the anti-Asian rhetoric, and looked at like actually what they have been doing. Universal design, we found throughout Asia, birth to earth, everything was really important. So you really could navigate the city by using public transit very well, and even better so than using a car. But it started out with an intentionality, and then was mandated to be that way from the beginning, to use public space and public dollars.
So we look forward to working with you all and collaborating on advancing transit equity during the COVID-19 pandemic and reset. There's our LinkedIns and our emails, and we're also on the Slack, the Active TransitCon Slack. And we'll be going into a live Q&A. We'll be looking at the questions from the chat box, and then there's a link to support our COVID-19 equity. So and stop screen share, and we'll look at the questions here. So Ethan, do we have any, I'm looking through, any questions, anyone?
Anyone
unmic themselves?
And we'd love to talk with you more in depth about the different research and these different concepts that we presented to you.
I have like a tiny question.
Sure.
I loved this presentation, but when you went to Singapore, did you talk to HDB about like how they integrate housing and transit?
Yes.
Yes.
So they have a 50 and 100-year plan, and they tend to plan in, and then they have a representative. They do deal with breaking it down by ethnic group, and they have representation in all their departments that are broken down by ethnic group. So, and they really are really key sticklers about how that, how the ethnic groups, how people are represented. They do not even entertain anything that would not look at everyone. So they start out with that in mind. And that's what we also found, like through Japan and China, they actually really look at these things, and as their green strategies going forward, we're really, we've also spent a great deal of time with different Chinese provinces and with Japan on how do these high-speed rail programs work, how do the integration within systems, and how does somebody get from the airport or get from their house or a medical facility, and then we've been talking to them as they've been doing better in COVID-19. Is there anything that we can be able to have in our COVID reset, or at least when it comes to like California, let's slow the progression of the virus and make sure that folks are getting what they need.
So there's a question in the chat from Lorena. What would public budgeting and finance in support of equity look like? So I can speak to Singapore, going back to the last question. You have HDB, the Housing Development Board, and LTA, Land Transit Authority. They work cross-departmental, cross-sector, so they do long-term capital planning and they do capital stacking. It's not disjointed like the US, like Carla was mentioning, focusing on pilot projects, focusing on choice lifestyle riders. They really look at all the different populations, then they really map out the plan, and then they have the funding to do it, and they make those investments and they make it long-term. So then they don't have to worry about fits and starts. In the US, in the federal context, and I assume that's what your question's referring to.
Well, I know from public budgeting, I was involved with San Jose in what they were doing with public budgeting and trying to do that. The challenge in this realm of decentralized, when like in the Bay Area, which is a hot mess. Like, I think that a lot of people are like, we're always talking about like the Bay Area as some example. I can tell you my neighborhood at home is absolutely devastated. And I live in the heart of downtown San Francisco. Like, it's nothing that we should be touting or talking about good things about. We really should be saying that this is an equity challenge for us to be able to do better and to build back better in the real sense. So when we're talking about these things in a decentralized way of working, then we're going to have to get back to the communities of color and the other and low income folks, and in this case first line workers that are needing to ride transit, and we really need to hear from them as we build these systems back better, and really be able to use our pilots in the Federal CARES Act and other subsequent acts to be able to actually address those problems, but be able to address them for all. And then we have to really question ourselves about where we're spending our budget. In San Francisco, we've got $800 million to close Market Street. And we have to ask ourselves, is that really a project now that COVID is gone and we've lost 1/3 of residents and we've lost those choice riders? Is that really where this belongs, or does it belong with free transit and making the infrastructure safer and more accessible? And so these are the things that we need to grapple with in the COVID reset, and then looking at biking programs, that they should not be able to use public space if those bikes are not trikes. You have to have trikes and you have to have bikes that are accessible, and they can't be where they require a mobile phone, which a lot of people now, sadly, they don't have the kind of service that they once had, top iOS or top Android type phones to run these kind of being able to buy fares, as well as being able to use all this gadgetry. And so the question is, where are we prioritizing in this COVID reset on fare systems and data and things, when we know that has not been traditionally or even working right now? Shouldn't those things be free? Keeping transit, if you have a municipality that has gone free, keeping that free.
Yes.
Being able to look at what are the seniors, those with disabilities needing. What do in Los Angeles, we just had a train driver gunned down. What are we doing to make? And we've had a lot of transit operators to die of COVID-19. What are those safety measures that we need to be focusing on, instead of kind of this narrative about biking and walking, when in some cases we're not going to fix that during the pandemic. Like we're not going to be able to do those things. But what we were able to do is do things like what Miami did, which was to make sure that Uber and Lyft was accessible to those who needed it in the areas that the transit wasn't running properly. And so our thing is to look at models that people can replicate and that they've been kind of not looked at, because face it, we have racism in transit. And because Miami, did this pilot primarily with folks, the first line workers, and really worked with Uber and Lyft, that program has not been talked about. And they were able to deal with digital divide issues. So they had phone lines and things that were very successful, versus keep talking like Los Angeles. I just saw, just launch more iOS apps for buying a transit ticket. And I'm going like, this doesn't, this is not solving the problem. So these are the things that we also have to be looking at. Who are we talking to in these public budgeting? Who's allowed to be there?
So if there's any follow-up questions, please connect with us on Slack, on the TransitCon Slack that Hayden and everyone sent out, and we'll be happy to chat offline.
And we want to work with you,
with you all in your agencies. And we just got a last question to address. What do you guys see as the first step to moving to more integrative planning in the U.S.? Why do we so struggle to plan integratively? Well, I can say we struggle to plan because it was designed in a racist system. And also an system that prioritizes lifestyle riders versus essential workers. And then, as you see, as the first step to moving to more integrated planning in the U.S., I think we have to definitely chat more offline. But please message us on Slack and send us a note.
The first step is to really start to figure out why our transit blew up in less than a couple of months. I think if you start to peel back the layers to why it blew up so fast. And then we've also got to get new models. We've got to look at Asia. We've got to look at anti-Asian sentiment in planning, and then we've got to look at what it is for the ridership in addressing that. And I think LA Metro under Phil Washington has done a pretty good job at that. And I would say for us to really look at models of BIPOC leaders in transit and some of the things that they've been doing during this COVID-19 reset.
Thank you. Looking forward to connecting and collaborating.